we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Coming up this week,
it's war in our time. After flirting with peace for a few miserable hours, the US and Iran are back to what they know best, taking uneven chunks out of each other amidst the world's prime oil pathway. This week, Iran levelled a terminal of Kuwait's airport and attacked the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. Then there was that mysterious Apache helicopter crash off Hormuz. Now, after the crisp kinetic strikes of the first few weeks, then the tentative tests of strength, the war is entering a new phase, one in which Iran shows that the US will not be able to achieve on the negotiating table what it did not achieve on the battlefield.
meanwhile, it's a thriving Asian tiger. The skyscraper skyline of its capital shows the bustle and optimism of the rising East. Mobile phones, electric cars. That's right. North Korea is this year's big economic success story, according to a new piece in the Wall Street Journal. Turns out the Hermit Kingdom is less hermetic these days. North Koreans have made good money providing weapons to Russia, and China has turned on the trade taps. Pyongyang no longer rations electricity to a few hours every day. So what happens when North Korea is no longer a Potemkin village, but a Potemkin megalopolis?
Meanwhile, lose a war, get voted back in. 3 years after the catastrophe in Nagorno-Karabakh, what inspired the Armenian people to re-elect Nikol Pashinyan? Perhaps it was precisely because of how vulnerable the country feels itself to be. The strategy is to buy off and shore up. Peace with Azerbaijan, EU candidacy, and normalization with old enemy Turkey. But how low can you lie in a region that Russia sees as its backyard?
But first, straight to hell.
The Iran war has reignited in recent days. We're recording this, of course, on the 9th of June, a Tuesday. But in the last few days, the United States, Iran, and Israel have all exchanged fire between each other. Firstly, the United States attacked Iranian radar sites and drone bases on its coastline and islands within the Persian Gulf in response for Iranian attacks on ships in the Gulf. Iran then responded by really levelling, it seems, one of the terminals at Kuwait airport, which is a major logistics hub for the US Army. And in addition to that, attacking yet again the US Fifth Fleet's headquarters in Bahrain. Then, though, the big issue was between Iran and Israel. Iran has constantly been signalling its displeasure at Israel's attacks on the Lebanon as part of Israel's long-standing campaign to weaken and degrade Hezbollah. Iran, of course, from the beginning has claimed that the ceasefire covered Israel and Hezbollah as well. It said that the ceasefire was about allies on all sides. And to be fair to Tehran, Egypt, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, all of whom were party to the negotiations between the US and Iran, said that the peace agreement, as far as they were concerned, as far as they understood, was covered Israel as well. And it was only after Israel then attacked Iran, I think on the very same day that the ceasefire was signed and agreed, that US Vice President J.D. Vance came out and said, no, actually it didn't cover Israel at all. But since then, Iran has been signaling increasing disquiet at Israeli attacks on Lebanon. And the straw that broke the camel's back appears to have been Israeli moves across the so-called Yellow Line at the Litani River in southern Lebanon, and also attacks on suburbs of Beirut itself. So now we're in a situation where Iran decided then to attack Israel directly, and Israel responded. I think the important way to view this is that the war is now entering a new phase. The first phase was the war itself. The first phase was the kinetic attacks by Israel, the Israeli Air Force and the US Air Force on Iran. and the Iranian missile response to that, and the Iranian drone response to that, and this exchange of fires in the kind of the hot war phase. Then after that, at the beginning of April, we had a ceasefire that was signed between the United States and Tehran, much, it seems, to the chagrin of Tel Aviv, which wanted to continue the war. And during the ceasefire, you've had a kind of an effort, essentially, by the United States to gain over the negotiating table through repositioning pieces within the region through things like a blockade and individual attacks on Iranian assets and attempting to shepherd ships out of the Gulf. They're trying to gain over the negotiating table what they failed to achieve in the kinetic phase of the war. Now I think we are entering a third phase of the war, which is the reignition of actual physical exchange of fire again. And I think what's clear here is that Iran is showing a really tremendous amount of self-confidence here. What it's basically doing is Iran is drawing a red line. It's saying, no, look, as far as we're concerned, if Israel doesn't stop, we're going to restart this war. Now that signals a high degree of confidence on the part of the Israelis. It is also showing that, contrary to the claims of the US, they have not achieved any of their aims in terms of putting an end to Iran's ability to manufacture and to fire significant amounts of drones and missiles. Of course, that's on top of the fact that there's no solution to the nuclear deal, on top of the fact that the regime, despite lots of assassinations of individuals within the regime itself has not changed. The government of Iran and the system of governance today is the same as it was before, except a few people have changed, much as it was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in the United States. Then, the system of government remained the same, and indeed the government stayed the same, except with Lyndon Baines Johnson taking over as president. Something quite similar seems to have happened on Iran, but on a larger scale because there's been more deaths. And then, of course, the additional point is that the US has a new war aim, which is to get the Strait of Hormuz back to the position it was before the US started its war. And that is no longer, nowhere near being achieved either. So this is the situation. We've got a new phase of war. It's a phase in which Iran is showing a great deal of confidence. It's setting red lines. It's attempting to reestablish deterrence. It's attempting to show that the US is not going to be able to achieve over the negotiating table what it failed to achieve on the battlefield. And ultimately, if this does indeed explode into another phase of war, I think we can expect to see the same strategic reality as previously reimpose itself. And that was the strategic reality which drove the US to the negotiating table to begin with.
So what's just happened in the past few days has at once provided an awful lot of clarity, but also an awful lot of confusion, at least for me. So on the clarity front, I don't know if listeners recall, but when the previous phases of the entire conflict, and I talk about the conflict going right back to October 7th, during those phases, we, or at least me, I think Andrew was less so, but I was very skeptical that Hezbollah had been degraded by the pager attacks and the bombing campaign against their leadership, which included the killing of Nasrallah, their then leader. I think that the current phase of the war in South Lebanon has proved that. Hezbollah are not just effective, they are more effective than they were, not because they've improved as a military force, because they've swapped out anti-tank guided missiles, Cornet systems that they were using for drones. Give Hezbollah drones, and you've basically got a light military force pretty much equivalent in its capabilities to the current Ukrainian army. Maybe it's not as big, but that is the capacity it has. And actually, the landscape of South Lebanon may make it even more favorable to use that type of warfare. The point is that the war so far in South Lebanon, which I think we've said on the show before, has not been covered sufficiently, has proven that Hezbollah were never degraded. There's no way that they got their capacities back online that quickly if they were completely decimated as an organization. And so, again, if people recall, I was trying to come up with an explanation for why Hezbollah were willing to engage in a ceasefire after the killing of their leader and after the failed incursion on the part of the IDF, the first incursion to enter southern Lebanon. Recall at the time they said they wanted, their stated goal was to get to the Litani River and carve out a safe space to keep the towns in northern Israel safe, and they never achieved that. They barely got a kilometer in, and they got beaten down, and they left, and they claimed a big victory, and they said the Hezbollah were destroyed, and et cetera, et cetera. So what was the explanation of that? I floated at the time that the explanation for that was political. That basically Israel engaged in a, let's call a spade, a terror bombing campaign on Beirut. And what that did was it put an awful lot of political pressure on Hezbollah. Because although Hezbollah are extremely popular in South Lebanon, and they have a base of support in Beirut, they are a Shiite minority, and they are not the major force in politics. And so if your city's getting horribly bombed, and leaders can point the finger at Hezbollah, that can impose some real political costs on the organization. And remember, this is an organization that, after hostilities cease permanently at some point, aspire to be a serious member of the government in Lebanon, which they probably will be, because they have a large base of support among the Shia community. And that may grow to other parts of the community if they end up winning the war in some sense or other, although it's never clear what that means in Lebanon. So I think what Iran drawing a red line on the bombing of Beirut says is that I was right. That I was right about that. That the pressure point on Hezbollah is not military. So the IDF can go into southern Lebanon and they can engage in a fight with Hezbollah. And frankly, that they can get lit up by drones, which we're seeing. I mean, the amount of drone videos to come out of southern Lebanon are, it's probably not as many as are coming out of Ukraine, because like, who watches all the videos from Ukraine? There's probably so many, but like, the volume is comparable. There's like 1 or 2 or 3 drone videos every day. These drones are like the perfect weapon for the Hezbollah militia. I mean, they're the weapon that they've probably been looking for since the 1980s. So clearly Iran was comfortable with that. They were comfortable with the IDF going into southern Lebanon and having out with Hezbollah, because I think they figure that they're going to lose that war. I think they're going to lose that war too. But I guess the Iranians figured out, well, they probably figured out in reality, because they have all the contacts on the ground there, and I don't. I was just guessing. But they figured out, apparently, that the bombing of Beirut was the weak point for Hezbollah. And so they set a red line under that. Now, the key on that is what you've just said. Iran were willing to launch strikes on Israel for a third country, for another country, right? Or, I know it's kind of for their militia group in southern Lebanon, but ultimately it's for another country. It's for Lebanon. So Iran were willing to say, we're not just striking you, Israel, because you struck us first. That was their position so far. They're saying we're striking you, Israel, because you attacked our friends in Lebanon. At that point, Iran is a true regional power. A true regional power. They are willing to go to war on behalf of their allies and proxies in the region. That means they're a regional power. That's the definition of a regional power. It's as simple as that. And so that's the clarifying part of all this. What I'm confused about, what I'm really confused about, is why Israel did it. Israel have just created a giant mess for themselves. They've had to back off the bombing of Beirut, not just because the missiles were going to rain down on Israel, and they would have. And, we know from previous iterations how that ends. It ends with, the Israelis and the US backing down. So they probably would have backed down from that pressure alone. But this time they had an additional amount of pressure being applied from the United States. Trump absolutely lost it with Netanyahu. J.D. Vance came out, I think, today and said American interests and Israeli interests are not always the same. That's heresy in American politics, or was until today, I guess. So they've kind of mucked up the political situation in an enormous way. And what victory did they get? A couple of targeted strikes on Beirut and, maybe 10 missiles launched at Tel Aviv or wherever they're launched at. So I don't get it. I don't really get what Israel are doing. They've come out since and said, if Hezbollah fire rockets into southern Lebanon, we are allowed bomb Beirut. Okay, maybe that's what they're trying to do. Maybe they're trying to establish red lines on both sides. But I don't think Iran's going to accept that one. I think if a war ever heated up between Hezbollah and the IDF, and the Hezbollah decided that they wanted to fire missiles into northern Israel, I think they would. And my sense is if the IDF or the IAF, more accurately, moved to bomb Beirut, Iran would start launching missiles on them. That seems to be the current state of play. So I don't know why Israel did this, and I'm actually really confused by it. I guess the simplest explanation is that Bibi was getting itchy, right? I mean, the ceasefire had been going on for a while. I very much so get the sense that the war against Hezbollah and the southern Lebanon is going not just badly, but very, very badly, and it's being sort of covered up. And maybe there was just pressure to try, something else and start with limited strikes on Beirut and see if that put enough pressure on Hezbollah to back down. Maybe. But I'm surprised that there wasn't sufficient communication between, triangulated between Iran and the United States and the United States and Israel to say, hey guys, if you try it on Beirut, they're going to launch missiles. Like this probably is being communicated in the negotiations, even though they've been quite limited in scope. And I think the Pakistanis said that. I think they said, yeah, this was like known that it was going to happen. So in one sense, it's clarified a lot. It's definitely clarified that Iran want to be a regional power, and they are a regional power now. A country that will strike on behalf of its allies and deter another country, and a country that will control the Strait of Hormuz, in effect, controlling the global economy. I mean, like literally controlling the global economy. Yeah, I think that's pretty much a regional power at that point. It might even be like a significant regional power, if you want to put it that way, rather than like Germany or something like that. Iran definitely has more power over world affairs than Germany. Let's just put it that way. Or probably any European country, or maybe even the EU, to be honest. I mean, in terms of world geopolitical power, probably have more power than the EU. Not economic power, fine. But in terms of geopolitical power, that's probably the case. What does it mean for the ongoing and soon to hit global energy crisis? Nothing good. Nothing good. I can't see the Strait reopening when all this stuff is being sorted out, and I can't see this stuff being sorted out overnight. We're going to have a few more like bad moves, if you know what I mean. There's going to be a couple more missteps. There's going to be a couple more issues that have to be clarified. And to my mind, it's just going to take weeks to do that, maybe months. And Iran are very clear that unless a very clear deal is laid out, the Strait isn't opening again.
Well, quite so. I think I'll answer your main question first, Philip. Why did Israel do this? Well, Israel is very much against any deal with Iran. And the reason that Israel is against the deal with Iran is because any deal that could possibly be signed at the moment will be really quite favorable indeed for Iran. It'll include things like sanctions relief. It'll include things probably like the return of Iran's frozen assets, its sovereign assets, which are frozen in jurisdictions like the United States and Europe. It will include a return to Iran to international trading in the global economy. It'll probably include some kind of security guarantee and a security agreement. That world is a world in which Iran can very swiftly see some kind of economic takeoff after all of these years of extremely and strict sanctions and tightening sanctions. And a world in which Iran can achieve an economic takeoff is a world in which Iran gets more powerful, right? So it hasn't had its regime changed to one that's pliant to Israel and Washington. It has not been bowed. It's in fact been strategically strengthened within the region, as you quite rightly said. And yet at the same time, it's looking as if this deal will give it the foundations to grow at a rapid pace economically in the near and medium term future. Does that sound like a world in which Bibi Netanyahu would feel comfortable? No, it does not. I think he would be much happier if the war continued as it had been before the April peace agreement. It doesn't matter to him if the US completely empties its magazine and essentially gives up on the rest of the world in order to drop some more bombs on Iran. Like, as much damage as can be done as possible is a good thing from that perspective. It doesn't matter that even success in causing the disintegration of the Iranian state would lead to regional security chaos, long-term involvement of outside powers, including the United States, increased migration flows to Europe. I mean, none of this really matters. What's important to him is to see Iran degraded as much as possible. And if an end to this war requires a peace agreement that allows Iran to exit on really very favorable terms, then it would be better to maintain a frozen conflict than to do that. Now, if the US looks as if it's getting close to that, well, what can we do? Well, what we can do is we can attack Lebanon in a way that puts Iran in a position of forsaking a regional ally and traditionally Iran's most important regional ally, or giving up on the deal, potentially, by attacking Israel. Right? I mean, does that not make sense to you, Philip? I mean, is that not an answer?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably right. You're probably right. Maybe I'm thinking too rationally. I mean, the rational response to that is very short-term move, guys, because the Americans are clearly signaling that, like, if you keep this up, they're going to dump you. They're just going to dump you. They're going to enter into a bilateral deal with Iran, and then they're going to leave you to your, whatever. You can go and try and strike Beirut, and you're just going to get, like, rain down missiles from Iran, and you're going to go to the Americans and go, can we have air defense? And they're going to go, no. Not that the air defense does much anyway. So, like, yeah, I mean, I think actually, to be honest, your explanation is probably the best one. I'm thinking too rationally. Probably it's Bibi's getting desperate. I think you're probably right. I think he's getting desperate. But the Vance statement today.
But I mean, do you think the US will ever dump Iran, Israel in that way? For instance, right? Let's say Trump says to Israel, like, look, stop doing this. Please stop doing this. And then Netanyahu goes ahead and he bombs the suburbs of Beirut again. And he says, like, look, we had to do it because there was some high-ranking Hezbollah officials there. It's completely self-defense. Israel has a right to defend itself. And Iran rains down missiles on Tel Aviv again. And the Israelis fire back. And it gets into a full-blown war. And then the Israelis contact the Americans and say, look, in addition to all of this ISR help you're getting, we also need these, and these weapons. In that case, is any current U.S. administration going to say no? 10 years time, then maybe. Yes, 15 years time, then maybe. You can see the sea change happening now, but at the top level, I can't imagine it being possible that any American would hold Israel's toes to the fire at a moment when Israel would be in a really serious battle against Iran, right? Maybe against Hamas or Hezbollah or the Palestine Liberation Army or whatever. Like, against them, they can hold the Israeli toes to the fire because those battles aren't existential for Israel. But a battle of the cities in which Iran and Israel were slinging missiles against each other and Israel was getting to the point where its magazine was low and it was going to have to, surrender? I mean, I don't know what. Like, I can't imagine a US president forsaking them in that circumstance. And maybe that's the calculation that Netanyahu's making.
Well, I mean, J.D. Vance's statements were clear today, and Trump apparently lost it over the phone at Netanyahu last week and leaked it via Barack Ravid, who's like the favorite leaks guy for DC. The thing is, like, Israel can't sustain an air war against Iran without American support. I saw some claims on Twitter that they literally can't run bombing raids against Israel without American support. I don't think that is true. That's like the conspiracy theory version where America's actually puppeteering and using Israel as this like front for its war with Iran. I think that's nonsense. I think Israel can run limited bombing runs against maybe the west of Iran with its own capacities, but like not for very long. I mean, the Americans and the Israelis did it together. Like, let's stop lying to ourselves. The Americans ran the bombing campaign and Israel tagged along for the ride, right? And the Americans couldn't even sustain it for that long. So I just don't think the Israelis have the capacity to strike Iran for very long. And so, if you put them in the position that we're talking about, and they try and bomb Beirut, which they can do any time of the day, they can get those munitions, by the way, from US Congress, but they can't get clearance to deploy American fighters and bombers and refueling tanks. They can't get that from Congress. They have to get that from the president, right? So they can refuel their bombs to bomb Beirut, sure, but they can't get the sign-off on an actual operation without the president's approval. So if they bomb Beirut and Iran turn around and missile strike them, I think the Americans are just going to say, knock it off, which is what they did this time. Very clearly, they said that this time. And if they went and bombed Beirut again, yeah, I can totally see the Americans just shrugging. I mean, they wouldn't even have to do anything. It's just a case of not doing anything. And then the Israelis would ramp up demands that the US come back and do another run of bombing. And then the Pentagon just says, yeah, we don't have the capacity for that. Sorry, we can't do it. And the president just goes, we don't have the capacity for that. We'll send you some bombs to bomb Beirut. Good luck. Yeah, I completely politically feasible as far as I'm concerned.
Jong Boom.
So there was an interesting article out in the Wall Street Journal, which I have very mixed opinions of, and I'll go into that shortly. But overall, the theme of the article is correct, and it basically said, I don't have the headline in front of me, but it basically said this year's big economic success story, or really the past 2 years' big economic success story, is North Korea. Now, listeners of the show will know that we both said this. When Russia opened its doors to North Korea and engaged in a formal alliance with them, and the Chinese really started supporting the country, or not even supporting, opening itself up to the country economically, we fully expected that North Korea would get quite wealthy quite quickly because it was starting from such a low base. Well, now the Wall Street Journal is reporting on it. And the article has kind of two faces, and one of the faces is the good face, as in the accurate face of the article, and the other is just absolutely economically illiterate nonsense. But it's economically illiterate nonsense that might tell us a little something about what's happening in North Korea. So the side of the article that I think is pretty credible is basically based on eyewitness testimony. So they're basically talking to people who've been over to North Korea and back a few times. These are like mainly tour guides, Western tour guides, Australian guys, some runners that go there for the marathon and are able to take some video and stuff like that. I also think they're actually kind of misleading that they have all these like Western sources. I think their real reliance is Chinese social media. It's China and probably Russian social media too, of tourists who are freely going to North Korea and just filming it. I think that's actually the source of the story, but they want to dress it up like these Westerners have been there and seen behind the curtain. Like, any Westerner can go to North Korea. I hope people know that at this stage. You can get on a train, I think, from Beijing and go to North Korea. Sorry if I've violated any international sanctions laws telling anyone that, but like, you physically can do it, and a lot of people have done it in the past. Not advising you do it, but it's perfectly possible. And these days, you can cross in from Russia, and there's no actual ban, as far as I know, on Western passport holders going into North Korea. I do think you have to apply for a visa, but, it's not as close to society as people make out. That said, what the article basically said was that people were actually living reasonably modern lives now in North Korea, at least in Pyongyang, the capital. We don't know a great deal of what's going on in the countryside. The article said stuff like there was still malnutrition, and a UN report said there was I've never believed any of this. There was a famine in the 1990s at the beginning of the sanctions. That's well documented, and it's admitted, I think, by the North Korean government, who blamed it on the sanctions. I don't really believe malnutrition reports. How would you know? I mean, you tell me on the one hand you have this super closed society and exaggerate how closed it is, and then you're allowing UN inspectors to go down and like take people's weight and see what they're eating. I don't believe it. So we don't know what's going on in the countryside. Maybe we do, and it's all over Chinese social media and Russian social media. I suspect it's not. I think those people are going to Pyongyang and this new beach resort territory that they've built. But we don't really look. I don't know what's going on too much in the countryside. But in the city, the Wall Street Journal is basically reporting that people are living not very opulent, but modern lives. That is, the streets are full of electric vehicles of varying quality, and I don't want to say everybody, but the majority of people seem to have some sort of a smartphone. Now, look, if people are well fed, they have access to housing, and I'll get back to that in a moment. They're able to use smartphones, and they have access to modern cars. I pretty much figure at that stage you're living a reasonably normal life. You're probably not the same living standards as the United States or even, the poorer parts of Europe. But, you're probably similar living standards to like the capital cities of the poorer regions in East Asia or something like that. Maybe you could compare it to, Ho Chi Minh City or something. I don't know. I don't know what the comparison is, but once you got access to those things, I think you're kind of good to go. The other thing is that the skyline has completely changed. There are pictures of this, and it is really fascinating. Pyongyang now looks like a more modern city than some Western cities, at least from its skyline. I've seen other photos, and like the streets still need a bit of work and stuff like that. Stuff that'll get done. But the skyline is like impressively modern. And when you look at it, it reminds me of the more modern parts of Beijing. It's not quite Shanghai territory, which is like something else entirely, but it reminds me of the more modern and especially residential areas in Beijing. And having spent some time there, they're pretty nice. The other thing that was highlighted was reasonably decent access to food. So some of the Westerners went to this like 100-story fancy restaurant, I guess fancy by North Korean standards, and had like really nice Korean food and like looked out over the city. Again, feels very like Beijing to me. So that's the kind of good part of the story. And what you can take away from that, and by good, I just mean accurately reported, what you can take away from that is basically North Korea is not poor anymore, and it's not backwards anymore. So it's just not. People need to get that idea out of their head. It's not as rich as South Korea, I'm sure, although measurements of wealth are complicated. It's not as rich as South Korea, but it's not poor and backwards and, anything like that. And like based on Potemkin village stuff that Kim Jong-un is showing to the world. It's just not that place anymore. The part of the story that really bothered me was when they tried to measure this, right? So when they tried to measure it, they went to these GDP estimates that are done by the South Korean Intelligence Agency. Now, immediately, look, if I'm going to dismiss UN reports as kind of sus, which they are, South Korean Intelligence Agency GDP estimates, like, okay, thank you very much. Like, that is old newspaper cuttings, okay? That is how would you even do that? Anyone who knows how national accounts are put together knows that you can't do that. You can't do that at all. If you ever look into, for example, reconstruction of GDP figures from like the 15th or 16th century, it's a messy business. With limited amount of information, you can't tell that much. And even those ones, those old historical GDP statistics, I'd trust them 100 times more than South Korean spy agency statistics, both from the point of view of how you can source the information, and also it's going to be biased. It's their mortal enemy putting the statistics together. Now, okay, fine, they used stupid statistics, no big deal, right? Well, sort of is a big deal, because I caught this part of the story where they basically said between 2023 and 2025, North Korean GDP had gone up around 3% a year. Okay, stop for a minute. We're talking about a country going from a really quite backwards place, like basically China in the 1970s. That might be the way to think about it. Like a poor country with not much in the way of technology and so on, and people kind of like not living in great lifestyles, maybe not having access to proper electronics and stuff. They're going from that to being a relatively modern economy, at least the city, at least Pyongyang. You can't do that with 6% GDP growth, man. Like, come on. 6% GDP growth gets you from there to there. No, it doesn't. I can tell you that immediately. But even beyond the anecdotal, the other stats that they say make absolutely no sense in this context. They say that the Russians have bought $10 billion worth of weapons. This stat is credible because you just calculate the amount of 155 artillery shells, just for example. That's the main thing that they're purchasing. From North Korea, and they have them in abundance, and then you just put a price tag on them. So, like, that's a real statistic. You can do that, and it wouldn't even surprise me if the Russians had published that statistic. They take that, and they take a kind of a basic GDP estimate of North Korea. Now, I wouldn't trust that too much, but it's a lot better than kind of growth figures or anything like that. North Korea have probably put out their own estimates. So's China at some point. Anyway, believing that statistics, which is kind of believable, they say that it's 27 billion a year, the whole economy. Okay, if you have 10 billion, okay, 10 billion worth of arms purchases, that's categorized as exports in the national accounts, and the overall economy is under 3 times larger than that. Well, there's your growth. Okay, so you calculate that up and you find just from those arms exports, North Korea has been growing at 18.5% a year for 2 years. Now that makes sense. That makes sense of the transition from, relative backwardness to like smartphone using, electronic vehicles anywhere, and reason. Oh, and they have like taxi apps and stuff, all this modern stuff that they didn't have before. Yeah, 18.5% annual GDP growth could explain that. That's explainable, right? But that's probably not even as much as it's growing. So, well, first of all, I'll say, in order to explain that number, those are the Wall Street Journal's own numbers. You'd have to assume, for example, that the additional 15.5%, so 18.5% growth minus the 3% that they're admitting, you'd have to say that the other 15.5 had been netted out by imports, rising imports. But that would show up in the investment and consumption statistics, and it will be offset. So that makes absolutely no sense. The thing is, it's probably even higher than that because they also say that Pyongyang has a building boom going on at the moment. And of course, these photos of the skyline show the building boom. And they estimate, and this is probably a real estimate too, because it's probably been put out by Chinese construction companies or by the North Korean government. They estimate 10,000 homes a year being built, which is more than like LA built last year or something like that. We'll add that on top, right? I think you're probably looking at annual GDP growth in North Korea of like 25% a year, something crazy. Now, that won't last forever, but in an example of North Korea, where you have this country that's basically kind of geopolitically sandwiched between Russia and China, both modern economies. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Russia's a modern economy. China may be the most modern economy, even though it has a bit of catch up in terms of its own income. These are modern economies. When you have this allied country that's providing like something really useful, 155 shells, which are really useful to the Russians, and it's been sanctioned and just cut off for so long, yeah, sure, you can have 25% growth a year. Why wouldn't you be able? I mean, that 25% growth is just literally selling the shells for rubles or whatever, taking the rubles in, the rubles have real value, and buying Chinese stuff with them and massively boosting consumption and investment, using those rubles to pull in materials and so on that weren't available to do the building boom, architects from China and so on to get them up to scratch and build the city. That's totally realistic. So I think basically North Korea in a couple of years is just going to be like visiting a regional town in China. That's my guess. So North Korea is not poor anymore. And in a couple of years, it's going to be not a major economy, but it'll be a wealthy place. And all the people who thought that it was going to remain the hermit kingdom forever, they were just wrong.
The really interesting thing about this is that it is a direct second order effect of sanctioning Russia. People might not realize that although Russia has traditionally been, particularly when Russia wasn't Russia, but it was in fact the Soviet Union, a close ally to North Korea. In fact, rumor has it, quite strong rumor, that the Kim dynasty actually originated in territorial Russia rather than on a mystical mountain in North Korea itself, although I will leave that to the professional historians. The point is here, though, that Russia is against nuclear proliferation, and therefore it joined the West in its sanctions against North Korea. It voted for the US resolutions at the UN Security Council to sanction North Korea, which is what put it under so much pressure, economic pressure to begin with. But once you sanctioned Russia, then, well, what real incentive do they have, especially now that North Korea has already achieved breakout level, and Russia at the time did need those. I think the old Soviet standard, Philip, is 152 millimeter, but the equivalent of 155 millimeter artillery shells. So that's what happened essentially. You sanction Russia and you build you essentially ring fence all of these countries together, but they reach a critical mass at some stage and they can start trading with each other. And you don't even necessarily have to pay North Korea in rubles or dollars or gold or whatever might be used, although I'm sure there is an actual currency exchange. Russia has loads of stuff that North Korea could find useful. Like, Russia's a natural resources superpower. Food, for a start. Grain, meat. This is all kind of stuff that Russia is a net exporter in. And then in addition to that, raw materials like steel, copper, nickel, timber, gold itself and other precious metals, And then all of these things, themselves can be used for barter trade if you don't want to go the currency route as a sanctioned country. So the interesting thing is that this is all a result of the Western decision to sanction Russia so heavily. Not only has that attempt failed, by the standard itself would set, given that Russia has outgrown pretty much every Western economy in terms of GDP over the last 3 or 4 years, although it is in a central bank-induced slowdown / recession. I'm not sure whether we're in fully recession yet. I'm not au fait enough with the macroeconomic data, but it seems that they're at least slowing down and maybe in recession. But anyway, that's a central bank-induced thing, and the sanctions certainly failed given the growth rates of Russia in 23, 24, and 25. But what they've also done is they've also cost the West its North Korea policy. The pressure has been well and truly relieved on North Korea because, guess what? Suddenly opening yourself up to trade with a country that has a large amount of money and plentiful natural resources, that does give your economy a huge boost if you've been completely cut off, as you quite rightly say. But guess what else it does? Well, now you are not the sole preserve of China. Now China has to, at least to a certain degree, seek to compete with Russia for influence, right? Because if Russia's entirely responsible for this big economic boom, then that gives Russia quite a lot of influence, especially if and when the war in Ukraine comes to an end and Russia isn't quite so desperate for 152mm artillery shells and tubes, right? Eventually that gives Russia quite a lot of leverage in North Korea, and Beijing naturally will have to compete, and that'll allow Kim to balance the two off each other. It really gives North Korea quite an advantageous situation, especially given the Chinese care increasingly little, it seems, about the Americans, given the back and forth on sanctions. So this has really been driven by US sanctions failing to take into account second-order effects. And it is a genuine boom economically, but it's also a tremendous benefit strategically for the North Koreans. Well done them. Make hay while the sun shines, I suppose. And it's certainly shining on Pyongyang at the moment, it seems.
Our condolences go out to our South Korean listeners who are about to experience the mother of all energy crises. Just saying.
Yeah, probably the North Koreans won't have to, right? They've got very good relations with the Russians, so there you go. Yeah.
Big changes coming to the Korean Peninsula.
And not only that, the really interesting thing, Philip, is South Korea is like, its total fertility rate is like, 0.7, 0.8? I mean, it's really catastrophic. I think the North... I should, some listeners, of course, will say, Philip, that I should have looked this up before the program. But the last time I looked, I'm pretty sure it was above or fairly close to replacement level. And that's a big differential. That sort of differential over like 2 or 3 generations, like say 60 years, can have actually a huge effect on the relative power of the two economies.
Armenian Roulette.
Armenian elections. Now, they are not necessarily top or perhaps even high on many people's list of geostrategically important events. After all, Armenia is a very small country with a tiny GDP, landlocked within the mountainous regions of the Caucasus, I should say. However, Armenian elections do have quite substantial geostrategic importance at the moment. Why is that? Well, let's go through it. The existing Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, is very pro-Western. He rose to power in something like a colour revolution in Armenia. And at first he was quite strongly nationalist. Perhaps we'll get into this a little bit later when Philip and I discuss this matter. But he's always been a kind of a bog standard USAID style reformer of a former Soviet Union nation, somebody who wanted to get rid of the corruption and shift his country toward a Western leaning stance. And indeed, that's still what he wants to do. He's managed to blame the catastrophic defeat that Armenia suffered against Azerbaijan on Russia for not defending Armenia. Again, we'll get onto that later. And he has used that to really argue the case for what he wanted to do all along, which was to move Armenia away from the Russian Federation and toward Europe and the Western Alliance. So there was an election last weekend, which was essentially a referendum on that position, and Nikol Pashinyan and his party Civil Contract won resoundingly. They won just a little bit under 50% of the overall vote. They won 49.86% of the vote. There were three other main parties, and strangely, they all had very similar platforms. There was Strong Armenia, there was the Armenia Alliance, and then there was the Prosperous Armenia. And all three of those parties wanted to maintain much stronger relations with Russia, saw there as being no strategic or economic alternative to strong relations with Russia, and believed that Pashinyan should be punished for his catastrophic defeat in the war, which is perfectly understandable. However, Strong Armenia, which is led, quite often we hear such and such party is pro-Russian. And what that really means is that party is not taking a stridently anti-Russian position. So, for instance, the current Georgian government is actually kind of neutral, ideally, but because they're not stridently anti-Russian, they're painted as pro-Russian. So somebody in Europe like Orban, for example, who generally wanted kind of peace in Ukraine, he's not lining up to allow the Red Army to water its horses in the Danube outside the Budapest parliament, but of course he's painted as pro-Russian. Now, Strong Armenia was the biggest party. Now, that is a pro-Russian party. I think we can fairly say that. It's run by a billionaire, or a very rich man at least, called Samvel Karapetyan, who made his fortune in Russia. I believe I'm right in saying that he has dual Armenian-Russian citizenship, and he's very much in favor of keeping strong relations with Russia. They scored only 23% of the vote. Then you have Armenia Alliance, which also wanted stronger relations with Russia. They're led by the former president of Armenia. They scored just under 10% of the vote. And then Prosperous Armenia, led by Gadzhik Tsarukyan, managed to score exactly 4% of the vote, which means that they miss out on seats in parliament. So what you see here really is a kind of a divided opposition, and that the divisions within that opposition have allowed Pashinyan to take advantage and score a resounding victory, given his support among the Armenian diaspora who live in Europe, especially places like France, and also those who live in Yerevan as well. The problem is that in taking Armenia away from Russia, he courts disaster. And I don't think it's possible to emphasize this enough, actually. When you actually start looking at the economic figures, and maybe you could tell us more on this, Philip Pilkington, it's really quite staggering the extent to which that Armenia kind of relies on Russia. For instance, 36% of Armenia's total foreign trade is with Russia. Like, that's, substantially more than a third. And the second is not even the EU, it's China, which is way down on 12.5%. It's like much less than half. It's almost a third as much as Russia's. And the EU is farther down again on 12%. I mean, this is really important. And then the other point is Armenia is actually quite reliant on remittances. I couldn't find exact figures, but I believe I'm right in saying that between 4 and 7% of Armenia's whole GDP is accounted for by remittances from abroad. And again, like, Russia makes up the vast majority of those remittances. So in the first 4 months of this year, I believe I'm right in saying that $1.3 billion of remittances came from Russia to Armenia. Now, when you look at Armenia's GDP, it's only $32 billion in size, right? So, 1.3 billion. That's like a fair old chunk of Armenia's GDP just in the first few months from remittances alone, even ignoring trade. And then the other point is that Russia accounts for the vast majority of Armenian energy. It gets a lot of its gas from Russia, and Russia gives it a 70% discount compared with European prices, right? So like the extent to which Armenia is reliant on Russia is really tremendous. And the idea that it can somehow shift away from Russia, especially doing so in what has been, from my eyes anyway, and I might be wrong, a quite antagonistic way. Like, I think if you're going to engage in this, you need to be quite subtle about it and move quite softly. But kind of being so unsubtle and so brazen about, wanting to move toward the West and all the rest of it seems to me pretty dangerous when your entire economy is reliant on Russia. And I don't mean that Russia's kind of bullying Armenia. So, I mean, probably it is bullying Armenia, but let's be honest. It doesn't have to give a 70% discount on gas to anybody. It doesn't have to allow for free flows of remittances untaxed for anyone. It doesn't have to buy Armenian brandy or whatever it is they're selling, right? Like, I mean, does Armenian brandy really compete with French or like French cognac or Armagnac or Spanish brandy? Does it? Probably not, but it seems popular in Russia. Maybe it wouldn't be so popular in France. So you've got to be quite careful here. And I don't think the Armenians are. I think they're courting disaster as it happens. And I think that it's a classic case where Europe and the West, I think they're going to be able to do this less in the future. But people like Pashinyan, of his generation, they grew up in an era where the West was the dream. To take your former Soviet country and to lift it up to Western living standards, to Western social ideals, to have Western style economies of freedom and economic prosperity and personal liberty and sophisticated conversations with other elites throughout Europe and the United States and Washington and London and Paris and Berlin. This was the dream. So it's very easy to find these people who have been pushed through all kinds of programs and fellowship programs and groomed for this role. It's very easy for the West to find people who are willing to put this dream ahead of the economic and defend and security interests of its country. And unfortunately, I see Armenia as being another example. I mean, we haven't even got into the fact that Russia has traditionally been its guarantor. It is now reliant on the goodwill of Azerbaijan and Turkey, two nations that are historically real enemies of Armenia. I'm not talking about like the British and the French the way we see each other now, but there was a genocide committed by Turkey against Armenians little more than a century ago, right? Just a little bit more than a century ago. Like the Azerbaijanis have just won a war, and as the price of that war, they've taken a big chunk of Armenian territory that was not recognized, but was filled with Armenians and ended up being ethnically cleansed of Armenians, and now they've lost a little sliver as a price of doing business, a little sliver of Armenian territory proper to Azerbaijan, and they're now relying on these without security guarantors, somehow thinking that the EU would come to their rescue, and the EU is reliant on Azerbaijani gas in part. I don't know. To me, Philip Pilkington, it really looks like Armenia is courting disaster with Pashinyan, but they voted him in. That's the result. So he now has a mandate to do what he wishes to do.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted the problem perfectly. Pashinyan is from that kind of Gen X boomer thing from the 90s. Young people today would call him a chopped unk, which means he's both washed out and old and out of touch, of course. So basically the explanation for Armenia's current problem is that the leader is a chopped unk. You can quote me on that. Multipolarity podcast, riveting analysis. But seriously, you haven't even mentioned the energy supply issue. Yeah, they get it at a massive discount, and Russia end up supplying 85 to 88% of Armenia's natural gas. and 70% of its electricity generation is dependent on Russia. And, if Russia decide to cut off any of that natural gas, where do they have to go to like beg for scraps? Azerbaijan. That's just taken their territory. Like, you couldn't have made a worse strategic play than Pashinyan. I mean, you've gone through it pretty well. I think I'm beginning to be reminded in Armenia of Saakashvili when he took over Georgia, and it ended in a war, basically, in 2008. The Saakashvili government, or regime, as its opponents know it in Georgia today, and it is not fondly remembered, really destroyed the country in a lot of ways. The economic destruction came first, and it ended in a conflict that the Georgians handily lost and lost territory. I do fear Armenia might be moving in that direction. Pashinyan seems to have a penchant for excuse making around these things. He's claiming, actually, he's made various claims about the loss of the war, but I think the core claim, from what I can tell, the one that's stuck, is he's basically blamed the Karabakh movement itself. So he's basically said, we had no rights to that land in the beginning. I have no strong opinion on that, but Pashinyan's saying this. And that in the 90s and the 2000s, people, irresponsible people in Armenian government, encouraged the Karabakh movement. And he claims that it was a giant strategic sore for Armenia. Now, whether that is true or not, if that's a strategic sore, what he's done to his country is strategically crippled it completely. I mean, maybe the Karabakh movement was getting in the way of a few things for Armenia, but it's nothing in comparison to the strategic situation that Pashinyan has put the Armenian people.
Can I just interrupt you there, right? Because what I find absolutely astonishing about this narrative of Pashinyan's, and actually it is the narrative that you read in the Western press, insofar as they concern themselves with Armenian politics. But if I mean, people forget that when Pashinyan was first elected, like before the 2020 war, like in 2019, his big slogan was Artsakh is Armenia, like this disputed territory, it's Armenia, and that's it. Artsakh is Armenia, and that's it. That was his big slogan, right? He used to lead chants of unification, like unification, i.e. unification between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh proper, right? Like, he was one of the key kind of stress points where the Azerbaijanis said, like, look, we're getting absolutely nowhere here. And Pashinyan himself has admitted that, like in the past, he's admitted that he got things wrong. Like he rejected the Minsk group framework for negotiations and, on returning the territories to Azerbaijan in exchange for some status for the Karabakh people, right? He showed no interest in compromise on the 7 districts. He tried to normalize and deepen Armenian control over the regions. Like, he was one of the main driving forces. I mean, I'm not saying he did so necessarily blatantly, where he made moves to recognize Nagorno-Karabakh. But, it was very clear that he was using that issue to bolster his nationalist credentials. And like, he was as responsible for anybody for the breakdown of this. And at the time, the Russians were counseling, look, stop this. The Azerbaijanis are way more powerful than you. If this comes to war, they're going to defeat you, right? So it takes some like brass neck to get away with the argument that Pashinyan's been able to get away with, that it's somehow like these people, these like separatists who were like hardline. I mean, Pashinyan himself was visiting them and actually like going to places like, so the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh is Stepanakert. And instead of going there, he was going to Shushi, which is like a much more sensitive place. Like, this was antagonizing the Azerbaijanis, right? Like Pashinyan was centrally involved in all of this before the war. It's like totally mind-blowing that he's been able to get away with the excuses that he has. And like, maybe I sound like a kind of Armenian opposition figure here. And like, I don't know Armenian politics enough to know the quality of the opposition movement, but it's kind of quite shocking to me, Philip Pilkington, that he's been able to do that.
My guess is, again, to go back to the Saakashvili analogy, the NGO presence in Armenia is enormous. I mean, Pashinyan is from that network, you know. I think he had Soros connections back in the day or something like that. But you know, it's NGOocracy. It's exactly what happened to Georgia, and the NGO trick worked once. It worked to get Saakashvili into power, and it ended in complete disaster for the country. And then, well, people have all seen recently in Georgia, even though, you know, they have more NGOs per capita than any other country in the world, even though they can literally just pay these people to go out in the streets and protest for weeks on end, still Georgian Dream Party get enormous amounts of the vote and the government's able to stand against the protest. So I think this is just one of those things where the Armenians are going to have to learn a harsh lesson, and they will. I'm sure they will. I just hope it'll be more an economic lesson and they don't end up in the same situation that Saakashvili put the Georgians in. That is going to active war with the Russians in some sense, which is perfectly possible because the people who push for these things don't care about the countries that they're dealing with. The idea that Armenia would go to war with Russia is so absurd that you'd think, why would anyone try that? Well, why would anyone try that with Saakashvili's Georgia? It was just as absurd then. So I hope it doesn't go to that point. It's possible, but certainly in the next 4 years, I'd expect the Russians to really cut the Armenians off economically and just say, you know, okay, if you guys want to trade with the EU, like, good luck. And then they'll move to trade with the EU and they'll realize, like, the EU is an undeveloping continent that can't, like, trade with them and has no energy. So yeah, it's going to be a hard time for Armenia, but, you know, what can you say, really? Like, fool me once, shame on me, I suppose. Fool me twice, shame on you, and they've elected the guy twice.
Yeah, I mean, on that, on that point, the EU, I believe, has promised a support package in the effect that the Russians put the squeeze on the Armenians. But it's not going to compensate for the kind of economic integration that we've talked about. It would be a bit like, Britain trying to cut off, or like, Scotland going independent, and the UK trying to cut it off, and the EU offering some, a couple of £1 billion here or there as a compensation package. It doesn't replace that degree of integration. When Russia's responsible for more than a third of Armenia's total trade, when it's responsible for whole percentage points of GDP just on remittances from Armenian workers in Russia alone, like when it's responsible for like pretty much all of your heating and your electricity, and or like a big chunk of your heating and electricity and gas, and offers that at a huge discount. And I believe I'm right in saying that I know this Eurasian Economic Union that the Russians have, this customs union and kind of semi-free market that the Russians have with a few other former Soviet countries. It's much maligned, and of course it is not as deep or as broad as the European equivalents. But that does give Armenia access to places elsewhere in the former Soviet Union where Armenian products are like known and respected. Some of their machine tools and as I say, some of their drinks and their foodstuffs. Philip, I mean, do you know, do you have a long-standing liking for, I don't know, Armenian brandies or Armenian foodstuffs? I don't like delicacies. No, I don't think you have. Like, they would get nowhere in Europe against the French and the Italians and the Germans, right? Like, that's just not how it works. And probably the same for their machine tools. I think the big concern for the Armenians as well, though, is eventually the Iran war is going to end. And we forget that while the Russian shadow looms large over the Caucasus, well, so does the Iranian. I mean, like, Iran borders both Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Turkey for that matter. And Iran had already signaled its displeasure about the use of the Zangezur corridor to connect Turkey and the Azerbaijani exclave with Azerbaijan proper in the Caspian Sea through that little strip of Armenian land. Like, the Iranians were not happy about that at all. And it's entirely possible that once Iran is free And especially given it itself is coming out of war in a stronger strategic position and likely in the near future an economically stronger position, it's possible that the Iranians could say to the Armenians, like, look, enough of this. You've been messing around for too long, right? We're not happy with this. It's not going to happen. Or it's possible that the Azerbaijanis and the Turks say, you know something, the Iranians are putting pressure on. We don't trust the Armenians, so we're going to have to send our forces and troops in to defend that area of land because the Armenians aren't capable of doing it. And then suddenly, from offering a lease to this little strip of land for a little corridor, now you've got Azerbaijani or Turkish troops defend. I mean, this is like all possible in the future of Armenia. Like, it doesn't look good at all. I would be really worried, and it's a big shame, actually.